the last piece I wanted to point out here, and this is specific to her statements on glucose for the brain, but there's some quotes here, and it says glucose is required to provide the precursors for neurotransmitter synthesis, and then the ATP, which you discussed already, to fuel their actions, as well as the brain's energy demand is not related to signaling. So I just wanted to point out here that the glucose in the brain it's not only about glucose for energy production.
Right.
The glucose is also important for the synthesis of different neurotransmitters and neuroactive compounds. So there's another quote here: because of entry of neuroactive compounds, i.e., glutamate, aspartate, glycine, D-serine, into the brain is highly restricted by the blood-brain barrier. These compounds must be synthesized from glucose within the brain. So even if you weren't using glucose as a fuel source in the brain, which, as you pointed out, you are, and you're always going to be using glucose as a fuel source of the brain, there's no evidence to support that the brain oxidizes fat and prefers fat as a fuel. It's literally glucose, and then ketones are a different story and are in essentially a starvation state. Is where most of the times they're being produced,
Yeah.
but you're still going to need that glucose for synthesis of different amino acids, or different, they are amino acids, but neuroactive compounds, neurotransmitters. So that's the same argument that she was making for fat. Like, oh, you need fat for structural properties in the brain. It's like, you also need glucose for that. You also need glucose for structural properties throughout, or signaling properties throughout other areas of the body, on top of energy metabolism. So it's an unfounded statement. There's literally no evidence to support the brain preferring fat for fuel. And then also the other statements were unrelated to the overall picture of what I think she was trying to get at. So
Yeah. Yeah, and those, a couple of those other main points, again, being that it doesn't require a lot of sugar to fill our glycogen stores, and that, any extra glucose we take in is getting stored as fat, those sorts of ideas. And also just that, again, any fat that we take in when we're getting at least 200 grams of glucose is going to be stored as body fat, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
One thing that you did mention was carbon dioxide. And so I did just want to acknowledge that is another reason for the reduced oxidative stress from ATP production from carbs versus fat is increased CO2 production. 50% more is produced with carbohydrate oxidation, and that also reduces oxidative stress, reduces reactive oxygen species by increasing oxygenation and the rate of metabolism. And we did a series discussing the importance of CO2, so I'll link back to those episodes.
Yep. Are you going to continue with the blood sugar piece here? Because I want to just directly address the quote about the Alzheimer's disease and carbohydrate oxidation. So the quote from the article is, so if we are sugar burners, what does that do to our heart and brain that prefer fat as a fuel? So we already debunked the idea that the heart or the brain prefers fat as fuel. Could this be a cause of Alzheimer's? After all, they are starting to call Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. So diabetes, first of all, isn't caused by by eating too much carbohydrate. But
Right.
The next piece that I want to discuss here, and this is specifically in relation to Alzheimer's disease and glucose utilization by the brain. So the quote that I have here is, one of the earliest signs of Alzheimer's disease is a reduction in cerebral glucose metabolism, and both human studies and animal studies suggest that disturbed glucose metabolism is associated with Alzheimer's disease progression. And furthermore, they said dysregulated glucose metabolism in metabolic disorders such as obesity or type 2 diabetes mellitus has been linked to Alzheimer's disease progression and cognitive impairment. However, a large clinical trial could not demonstrate a beneficial effect of aggressive glucose lowering on cognitive outcomes in diabetic patients. So essentially, what you're seeing here is that Alzheimer's is characterized by decreased glucose utilization inside the brain. So it's actually a problem of the brain being able to use glucose. And as the disease progresses, it technically gets worse. And then also aggressively trying to lower blood sugar levels in obesity and diabetes through the generally accepted mechanisms in mainstream medicine, which is a whole host of drugs, metformin, the GLP-1 drugs, the sulfonylureas, whatever they are, hasn't improved outcomes or hasn't improved Alzheimer's. It isn't showing a beneficial effect. And the one thing that I want to talk about here is that, as we mentioned a little bit previously, is that both diabetes and obesity are characterized by higher amounts of free fatty acids. and fatty acid and lipid mediators in the blood, and impairments in utilizations of the tissues by glucose of the tissues of glucose. So like the tissues are having a more difficult time oxidizing glucose effectively, and the basically there's a lot of fat floating around in the bloodstream, which both of these things fly in the face of the idea that we want to be optimizing fat burning over sugar burning, especially in this case for the brain. And then also trying to pin utilization of glucose by the brain as a possible cause for Alzheimer's disease, just because they're calling it type 3 diabetes, is not an argument, and it's not substantiated by anything. In fact, the research is showing the opposite, where you're seeing that dysregulated glucose metabolism inside the brain is what is part of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, basically that an inability to burn carbohydrate is the problem, is the pathology. So to suggest that you don't want to be doing that is suggesting that is the pathology. Like that is a suggestion that you want to be creating this metabolic dysfunction, and that's a good thing, even though that is what you're seeing in things like type 3 diabetes, so to speak, and Alzheimer's or actual diabetes, which, as you mentioned, it's another thing I wanted to. So there's two things I want to say here, which is one, that these things are not caused by having too much glucose or by burning too much sugar or anything like that. Instead, as you said, deficiencies in those things are what's driving it. And as you mentioned as well, carb intake is not causing an inability to metabolize carbs. This is something we've talked about in more detail, and so I'll link to these to the episodes and articles explaining why taking carbohydrates does not cause insulin resistance and doesn't cause diabetes, because that is what a lot of people in the low carb space suggest, and it's something that's directly related to everything we're talking about, but just kind of a whole separate conversation that we've already had. So I'll link back to those times where we've explained why. Instead, it's really the opposite, that not having enough carbs would drive that pathology, and the problem is an inability to use the carbohydrate, not too much carbohydrate.
In fact, the low carb, high fat diets cause insulin resistance. This is known, they cause insulin resistance. And it's because you basically have an excess of fatty acids in the bloodstream and a decreased amount of blood sugar coming in on a regular basis. And most of the tissues are oxidizing fatty acids instead of oxidizing glucose, which has different effects on specifically insulin signaling and then also insulin sensitivity of the cells because they're being flooded with the fatty acids, which will increase the reactive oxygen species that's being produced during oxidation and help to promote the insulin resistance. It's literally the effect of burning an excess amount of fatty acids. So it's and again, this all comes from the idea of like, oh, if you high blood sugar is the problem with these states, is that you have high blood sugar. And it's the problem with these states is that you have high blood sugar because you're not able to oxidize the sugar that you have available.
Right. The blood sugar is a symptom. The elevated blood sugar is a symptom. And another piece here beyond the high free fatty acids and all of that is the lack of energy and the resulting high stress hormones, which are also major drivers in that pathology, which ties in directly to this next concept that Judy talks about in this article, which has to do with blood sugar regulation and the relationship with stress and carbohydrates. So she includes a few quotes here, and this first one is a quote from her book that she quotes in her article. And so she says, when someone consumes too much sugar, their body goes into an emergency state. It has to prioritize shoveling away sugar in the bloodstream. The body prioritizes life or death matters and focuses on clearing excess sugar from the blood, so it uses up essential nutrients to produce insulin, to clear glucose from the blood, and fructose from the liver. There's a couple other quotes that are along the same line that we'll share in a moment. But a couple of points I just want to touch on here from this quote. So first, she mentioned this idea that this is a life or death matter, that the body's going to an emergency state when blood sugar is elevated, and that if it's not cleared, you'll die, and so you have to clear this out with essential nutrients. I just wanted to say, for one, you don't die if you have. Obviously, if you have like way too much blood sugar, like sugar in your blood, I guess eventually you die. But this is not something I'm suggesting as a good thing or anything. But people with diabetes walk around with blood sugar levels of 200 or 300, and they're alive.
I've seen people at 500 in the hospital and having normal conversations with me. Now, the problem isn't that their blood sugar is that high as much as it is that they're not using that sugar.
Right. And that's why it's high in the first place. And it's just a symptom of the problem. And the reason why they're not using that sugar is not because they don't have enough essential nutrients to produce insulin. That's really the amount of nutrients required to produce insulin is minimal.
It's a peptide hormone. It requires amino acids.
Yeah.
In case anybody like, it requires amino acids and probably some marginal amount of vitamins and minerals in the pancreas.
Yeah, and that's not a limiting factor. Like essential nutrients for insulin production is not a limiting factor in diabetes, in elevated blood sugar, and insulin resistance, in any metabolic condition. But yes, there are mechanisms in place to clear blood sugar from our blood, and that's so that it's not to clear it because you're clearing out something toxic that's in our blood, but instead our blood is just a transportation highway to transport nutrients. And so in order for the carbohydrate to go from the food that you take in into your digestive system and then into the actual cells to be used, it has to go into the blood, and then it has to be transferred from the blood to the tissues in the exact same way that fat has to be transported. It's not literally the exact same, but you take in fat from your food, it gets digested, it goes into the blood, and then that gets transported into tissues to be used.
Or the liver has to waste resources producing bile acids to digest and emulsify the fatty acids that you're going to absorb. And it also has to waste resources producing lipoproteins, which are also proteins. So they are strings of amino acids. Insulin is a string of amino acids. So it's just like, there's no argument there. Both things require resources to function appropriately.
Yeah, and obviously you're kind of saying wasting resources in a rather facetious manner, yeah. Right? Because I just want to clarify that for listeners in case they weren't sure, because it's extremely minimal. Obviously, the amount of energy we produce from these things is way more, and the nutrients we get from these things is way more than we require to utilize them in the first place. Otherwise, we would die if we were using carbohydrates for fuel. If it took more to use them than we got from them, more or less.
The one point I just want to bring out here is that, first of all, there's only two areas of the body that really require insulin to take up carbohydrate, and that's going to be the muscles and the fat. The rest of the body can take up, or a large majority of the rest of the body can take up glucose without insulin. And it's really the GLUT4 dependent areas, which is the muscle or the fat tissue. And I just want to point this out here that both the muscle and the fat tissue have to, at least from my perspective, have to use insulin to drastically increase their uptake of glucose, because they're not prioritized to increase glucose because everywhere else is prioritized first. And then the body has very delicate and calibrated mechanisms to regulate what areas are going to get glucose. So it's kind of like when you eat something that has carbohydrate, your intestine and your liver and your pancreas are all signaling, okay, this is how much carbohydrate we have coming in. And then this is how much we're going to put to liver glycogen. This is how much we're going to put to our other organs and tissues. And then it's like, oh, we have this excess here that we don't have to use in these other areas. So we're going to put out a specified amount of insulin to move that carbohydrate to the muscle and the fat. And the fat being for storage for later point of time, which is physiologic, not a pathology. It's very normal, and it's actually desired in most circumstances. The pathology with obesity is a different story. And then for the muscle, it's like, oh, we have enough carbohydrate here to fill the glycogen store. It's like it's a regulated system to calibrate a nutrient and energy source coming in. It's not wasting resources. It's done on purpose.
Right. And as you said, it's most tissues are tissues that use the most amount of glucose don't require insulin to take up that glucose in the first place.
Like the central nervous system.
Right, exactly. Like our brains, like our livers. And as you said, yes, if there's beyond that, then we'll be storing a lot of it as glycogen. And then yes, beyond that, we'll be storing some of it into the fat tissue. And it's, as you said, that's not pathologic. It doesn't mean you're going to be gaining body fat, because there's always flux through the fat tissue, substrate coming in and then substrate leaving. And at the same time, you talked about how we can store as much as 500 grams of glycogen. Well, even, as you said, up to more like 800, or in the study, I think one person was storing as much as 1,000 grams of glycogen. And that's in the liver and muscles. So at the point that they were storing that much glycogen, yes, they were also storing some of it in their fat tissue. But in most people who are just normally depleting glycogen from their liver and muscles as they're going about their days, you've got a lot of glycogen to refill, a lot of glycogen store space to refill before you're storing it as fat anyway. And again, before that, there's all of the other areas that are immediately using a ton of glucose, like our brains and like our livers and
will
kidneys.
upregulate the use of glucose as you take in more carbohydrate. Your
Right.
body will upregulate its carbohydrate oxidation, and then it also will upregulate your hormone systems, where providing adequate carbohydrate will optimize androgen and progesterone production, and then also thyroid function. And then those are anabolic processes that allow you to use that glucose for other things besides just storing fat or oxidizing it. And then thyroid hormone upregulation itself can upregulate heat production through the brown fat, and then and increase energy expenditure from the food you're taking in general. And they see in overfeeding that thyroid function increases, and then increases heat production through brown fat, increasing the carbohydrate and fat oxidation in the body overall. So it's not just a stale, stagnant system
Mm-hmm.
that you take in carbs, you take in fat, they're either oxidized or turned to fat. There's so many other mechanisms for like increasing oxidation of one or the other will increase with the amount that's coming in, and then increasing storage as glycogen, or it's like a very adaptive fluid system. It's not this like stale, either you oxidize it or you turn it to fat idea. That's a very two-dimensional and distorted view of what's actually going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about, you had alluded to the effects of carbohydrates and blood sugar regulation on the hormonal system, and I want to talk about that next. But I know you wanted to mention the drinking Mexican Coke, the mountain, and clearing that carbohydrate from the blood. That quote.
Oh yeah. So if our blood sugar has about 4 grams of sugar at any given time, how do the foods listed above impact the blood? Even drinking one Mexican Coke is 39 grams of carbohydrates. That's nearly 10 times the range that's considered normal for the blood. Imagine what your body has to do to remove the excess sugar in the blood. And then imagine doing that every single day for multiple meals and multiple snacks a day. That can't be good.
That was a quote, by the way. This is a quote from Jay's
Yeah,
article.
that's a quote from the article. It's such an absurd quote. The, from multiple perspectives. Like it I don't it's like kind of mind blowing that this quote, because it just doesn't make sense at all to me, especially when you consider the mechanism of the body in general. For example, when you drink a Mexican Coke and you take in 39 grams of sugar, that 39 grams of sugar doesn't hit your bloodstream all at once. Your gut modulates your gastric emptying so that you're regulating the amount of carbohydrate that you have going into the system in a metered, tapered fashion. So your carbohydrate content can sit inside the stomach for a period of time before and slowly drip into the small intestine, and the intestine can regulate and titrate the amount of carbohydrate that's coming in. So you don't get 39 grams at once. Second of all, once the carbohydrate gets across the intestinal epithelium, when it moves through the different GLUT receptors and then gets into portal circulation, it then goes to the liver, and then the liver processes, it goes to the liver, and it also, there's a stimulatory response to the pancreas. So while you're dripping this carbohydrate, the liver and the pancreas are determining how much sugar is going to be pushed to your fat or to your muscles, while your red blood cells in your blood use the sugar as an energy source, and then the brain and central nervous system and other organs take up what they need because they're not insulin dependent. So you're never going to have 39 grams of blood of sugar hit your blood all at one time and then drastically dysregulate your blood sugar. That's an impossibility. I guess it's possible if you inject it, but it's an improbability, I guess, is more, I guess.
It's never going to happen in a real physiological, like in a real practical situation.
Yeah. So it's just like that context, it doesn't even make sense. It's literally a fictional context to think about things from. It's you drink the Coke, your body meters out the amount of carbohydrate that you're going to be ingesting at the intestinal and the gastrointestinal level. And then your liver and your pancreas, and then all the other factors and tissues in your body are regulating what's going on with that carbohydrate and keeping it within the specified range. That's why a diabetic who has a severe blood sugar dysregulation only goes to a small amount of adjustment, milligrams per deciliter. They're over 100 milligrams per deciliter instead of being below the 100 milligrams per deciliter fasting, or they can go over 200 milligrams per deciliter when eating or whatnot. It's an extremely small amount compared
Right.
to this amount. It's not 40 grams of sugar hitting your bloodstream at one time. It just
Right. Even you're saying even when you're severely diabetic or
exactly.
considerably diabetic, you're still not seeing that situation.
And again, the thing is, those mechanisms, while they may not be working perfectly, they're still going on. The problem with these diabetic states is that these cells are not taking up that sugar. The body is like, the cells are kind of like, whoa, because of a host of factors that we've discussed before. So again, the problem isn't the amount of like, yes, could the blood sugar in the excess sugar in the bloodstream possibly be a problem over the long term? Of course, that no one's arguing that. The argument is more, why is it elevated in the first place? And it's because those cells aren't uptaking the sugar. And that's the actual legitimate problem. They're not uptaking, right, utilizing the sugar appropriately. That is a legitimate problem, not that you have X amount of blood sugar in your bloodstream at one point in time.
Right. And as you said, you could make the argument that having extremely elevated blood sugar, a symptom of the problem, can also come with side effects.
Yes.
And that's, again, still debatable, but a different conversation or in a different argument than just increasing in blood sugar being the problem. And yeah, as you mentioned, this is just basically a fictional situation that could never happen. And then the argument based on that is to imagine what your body has to do to remove the sugar, and then imagine doing that every single day for multiple meals and multiple snacks. That can't be good. Again, we're just kind of creating a hypothetical situation and then leaving our like
fictional hypothetical situation,
right,
and then trying to make extensions from that. It's like, we don't have to imagine what the body does with the blood sugar. We know what it does with the blood sugar, and it's nothing that you suggested in your hypothetical argument. It's just, you're not your fictional hypothetical argument. This might as well be like a child's storybook discussing blood sugar instead of actually looking at what's specifically going on.
Yeah.